Hello, I am so excited about this conversation and getting a chance to talk to you all about ambitious women and the relationship between the way that ambitious women are often treated and this play, Mackers. Shakespeare's Macbeth. So I wanted to start with if each of us can introduce ourselves. I'm Rachel Finley. I am the Intimacy and Care Coordinator for Black Girls Love the Bard. And if each of us can just introduce ourselves, we'll start there and then we'll jump into the questions and conversation. So, Lavina, would you introduce yourself first?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. I'm Lavina Jadlani. I use she, her pronouns. I am calling in from the unceded lands of the Dakota people, colonially known as Minneapolis. I identify primarily as a director, adapter, and activist.
Awesome. Thank you, Lavina. And Don, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, Dawn Monique Williams. I use she, her pronouns. My home is on Chochenyo speaking Ohlone land, which today we know as Oakland, California. But I am in Western Massachusetts doing a residency at UMass Amherst, which is on Pecumtuck and Nipmuc land. And I, like Lavina, also primarily identify as a director. Also an educator, administrator, and activist as well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Don. And Tia.
Hi, you all. I am Tia James. I go by she, hers. I am coming to you from the lands of Okanichi, Eno, Sissipahaw, and Shakori. I identify as an actor, teacher, director, and a vocal coach.
Awesome, thank you. And I forgot to mention, I use she, her pronouns, and I am coming to you from the land of the Peeposh and O'odham peoples. In addition to my role with the Black Girls Love the Bard, I'm also a core collaborator for The Blueprint, and this conversation is being hosted in collaboration between The Blueprint and Black Girls Love the Bard. The Blueprint is an actor training program for people of color at no charge to the students, relying on donations and grants to provide training for actors of color. So, getting straight into this conversation, let's jump in first. Tia, if you don't mind giving us a little background on your take and where you're taking this production of Macbeth.
Yeah, so Macbeth, immediately when I had read the play and I was invited to do it and thinking on it, the first thing that hit me was like, a life of crime. I mean, it's thinking about, entertainment, things that you watch, things that really kind of hook you in. All of a sudden I was like, oh, they're involved in and surrounded by a community of crime. And so then after that, I started doing a bit of research and what really makes up the elements of crime. So thinking about and diving deeper into, okay, crime, violence, drugs, prostitution, and then looking at how those things influence, our lives today, our lives in the past, and building upon that. As I was doing this research, I had found, who I did not know before, a woman named Stephanie St. Clair, who was freaking boss. And obviously because Black Girls Love the Bard, I'm, surrounded by these female identifying artists. And so I'm like, oh, all of these characters are going to be built upon these really strong, ambitious, brilliant women of color. And so when I found Stephanie St. Clair, who ran the crime scene, some research said that she started in prostitution, then kind of, amassed this bundle of funds. And then from that kind of built her empire, and then was getting into gambling, I think some mentioned maybe drugs, but the bigger, kind of idea that really hooked in for me was that during that time period, so we're talking Harlem, 1930s, that she was really using her influence to help people of color, to help the Black community. So for example, things like Black people would go to banks, to these white institutions and want investments, and they wouldn't receive any help. And so Stephanie St. Clair would use her funds to help further Black people. So this was really a great hook in for me of this life of crime and how a community was centered on, or prospered from, a woman in charge. So that's my springboard.
Awesome. Thank you, Tia. So the first question that I wanted to jump into is, as a woman who directs, because all of you are also directors, what has your experience been when people learn that you are a director, and how have you how have the people responded to you in the rehearsal space, in the at the design tables, etc., in those spaces where you're taking that role of leadership as the director of a production? So, Dawn, would you be interested in jumping into that question first?
Absolutely, because that has been an evolution, because I've been directing over half my life, which sounds like the craziest thing to say. But certainly when I was starting as a young professional, still in my early 20s, no one took me seriously, right? And if I'm being honest, it's probably only within the last 5 years that I felt like anybody took me seriously. It really was not until I sort of kind of got into that late 30s, early 40s threshold where I had a body of work that I guess could start to speak for itself. I don't actually know the psychology of other people, but I know that for a very long time I was not allowed to be the authority in a room. My choices were always subject to critique or further probing. And for a while you sort of normalize it. Certainly, it's baked into a grad school experience. So you think, well, I'm in a student role, so I kind of have to just go with the flow. But when I started to notice that my male counterparts weren't being treated the same. I think of even just showing up for grad school interviews as a director and seeing so many guys in hoodies and a blazer, and then all the women are in character heels and a skirt or a pantsuit, and it's wait, we really got dressed up for this, and these dudes are in sneaks and a hoodie. And that's the vibe, and you see it. That's how so many artistic directors show up to make an opening night toast. Where I really where something really clicked in for me was during my time at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where I was sort of very closely and deeply mentored by Bill Rausch, who started Cornerstone Theater and really has this consensus-based model and all of this stuff. And I would really watch him create so much space in a room. And I love that so much. And I really think of myself as that kind of director. But when I tried it, it's rejected. Not anymore, but initially when I tried to, it's oh, she doesn't know what she wants. I have a practice of, I give my notes and then I will say anything for me. And I actually got feedback that this was rejected by some of the actors. They were like, what does she mean anything for her? We're not going to teach her how to direct a play. These are direct quotes. And so I really had to understand that that there really is a marked difference between how women are treated. And I think it's further complicated by being a woman of color and still a relatively young woman, and to have this ambition to want to do Shakespeare, is like added to the mix, where this is somebody's sort of precious Western canon, where the gatekeepers or the authorities for so long have been white and predominantly male, that as a woman of color stepping into that saying, I want to do these plays. And it's like, but what's your training? And did you go to Yale? Or did you, did you go to RADA and all this stuff? And it's like, no, I went to Cal State Hayward at me, like, but it's been a journey. And before we went on air, I was sharing that just one piece of advice I was given was that, like, well, you have to not be afraid of being called a bitch. I remember that from grad school, when it was like, that idea of like, but I still want people to like me. And then it's like, well, you have to get over that. You have to let that go. So I could say more, but I definitely want to hear from my pals here. What's up with them?
Thank you, Dawn. Tia, would you like to jump in next?
Sure. I think it's a wonderfully complicated question. Thinking about my journey, it's complicated because, we're all very, very different. I think for me, when it comes to my directing, I, of course, started as an actor. And so I've gained a lot of useful information, because you'll have some directors who don't necessarily know how to talk to the actor. And so I think in my experience of being an actor, I have navigated and have some intuition about how one communicates with the artist. And then because I started teaching afterwards, then I have such a heart for the student. And so then I realized that my directing, it also feels like class. And it's really important to me too. Education is really important to me because, and I think why I still teach at university, I loved grad school. I wanted to stay. All of my classmates were ready to go. But I loved it because it was this idea of I could fail, I could get things wrong. Mm. This is a place where, we're supposed to learn. The purpose is to learn and grow. And so I have very much a heart for the student. And so then when I started directing, I think that all kind of bleeds together. So it's very collaborative. I think once I started to really, rock and roll with directing, there definitely was a part of imposter syndrome for me, even in my teaching. So there was a point where I needed to trust myself and actually, funny enough, because I teach voice, I think it's, everybody's journey is incredibly unique. And it's like, oh, God gave this journey to me for a particular reason. And it was to actually, hey, Tia, you're going to teach voice because you need to learn and exercise your own. And so really trying to find my voice in the room, especially when directing. So it's like, okay, everybody is looking to me for the opinion. And so I think you had to get out of like imposter syndrome real quick. But I've also felt when it comes to being a person of color, it has been challenging because I have noticed sometimes where there would be, let's say, an actor who would respond to an idea of mine in a particular way. And I would, I think early, well, not even early on, because, I think it still happens, but when someone responds in a certain way and that response feels negative to me, and not necessarily like collaborative, like we can debate or you can have one idea and I can have another. But when it gets to a certain place where the energy doesn't necessarily feel good, my first thing is like, damn, if I was a white man, I think I would have been addressed differently. Or if I was a different color or a different gender, maybe my idea would have been taken or received in a different way, a more expansive way. And so I think that there's always that kind of wrestling, but then I'm a very spiritual person, and so I'm definitely always bringing just a higher creative energy into all of my work. And so there's a certain point, whether it's my teaching or directing, where I where I when things kind of get like that, or when I'm feeling like, gosh, am I being respected? Are my ideas really being received? There's a certain point where I've gotten a little tired of having to be an advocate for myself. And so now I just rely on my genius. It's like, I ain't got to say that. I ain't got to say too much anymore. And I think that also has come from me just understanding my creativity and relishing in my creativity. I also just want to say, to me, and directors are all different. I think I found my hook as a director in understanding how I'm supposed to serve everyone. And so how I'm supposed to serve the actors, how I'm supposed to serve the designers, that literally walking into the room saying, I am the servant of everybody here. How am I supposed to help them get their best selves out? And so sometimes it's me just allowing, the artist, the actor, the person in the room that might have that resistance to have that moment. And then my genius will say otherwise, or sometimes challenging. So I think that it's wonderfully complicated. Every situation is very different. And I think the more that I practice the thing, the more confident I can be. And like, I don't need to prove myself to anyone. I just need to be in the room and be ready to, receive, I guess. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tia. Lavina.
I love this question, and I love listening to you all speak. I'll just add that so I can't help but think that I'm here in Minneapolis. I'm working at the Guthrie right now, and I remember the first time I walked into that building, somebody said, "Oh, are you a new volunteer usher?" And I said, "No, I direct on the main stage." And that happened to me at Oslo Rep too, right? Like I walk in with the script in hand, and they're like, "Oh, are you a student?" I'm like, "No, I direct on the main stage." I remember I had somebody once walk into my rehearsal room and said, "Oh, are you the ASM?" And I said, "No." They said, "Oh, well, you look like you're in charge." Like, I am in charge. I'm the director. And so like I think that, and it's funny because for me, my training, my undergraduate degree is in design, and I'll be honest that one of the reasons I got out of that was that I found particularly I loved working in shops, but I found the culture to be very, very mask, and entirely white at the time, and so I just found it to be not as inviting to me. I will say that I think some of you know this. I have this like bug in my brain because part of my identity does involve being the child of immigrants, and my parents want to one of their lifetime goals is to like truly visit all 50 states, and for me one of mine is to direct a play in all 50 states, and part of that is saying, hey, what would it say about the state of our field if somebody who looks like I do could walk into a theater in 50 or however many states there are at the time and say, I direct on the main stage. Like Dawn, I have spent a lot of time assisting and assisting primarily cis white men, including we have Bill Rausch in common, and have totally had that experience of like, I'm going to try to emulate this tool, and then understanding, oh, it's received very differently when that language comes from my mouth as opposed to the mouth of a cis white man. And like, I actually had somebody at the end of As You Like It here in Minneapolis come up to me and say that the process had been very special, but that they found themselves wondering at multiple times, like, I wondered if I listened to you in the same way that I would have listened to a white man, because that's who I'm used to being directed by when I do Shakespeare. And that's for me, like, that's an impossible question to answer, but I appreciated that actor felt comfortable sharing that potential bias with me. Yeah, I find that, right, I talk about identity conscious work, and for me, there are parts of my identity that are fixed, and there are parts that are fluid. One part that is fluid is my age, and I love telling people I'm 38 now. Most of them don't believe it. I just had a room full of students like yell at me about it. I'm like, why would I lie? But I think that also, that is also for me part of this question. Also, I think is the ageism I experience when I walk into a room and say like, no, I've directed Shakespeare at the Guthrie. I've directed Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and people are like, really? And again, it's one of those things that's like impossible to answer. But I find myself going, oh, would you ask? This is what, right? Would I be that wunderkind in the hoodie and the jeans? I also, for me, and I know we're here to talk about ambition, but for me, also vulnerability goes hand in hand with that, and that's also something that I, for example, will share that I'm pretty open about the fact that I'm a recent breast cancer survivor, and especially when I was 1 or 2 years out, I would get questions like, "How's your health?" That again is possible to say. It's impossible to say, but it did at the time feel gendered, and I felt like, oh, would you, here I am trying to like share an important part of my identity and also be vulnerable about a thing that's going on with me, and I think actually that makes me better as an artist. But it was interesting to see that value questioned in a way that I couldn't help but find myself wondering, oh, if I identified differently, would you still have that same question about vulnerability? Or would it be like, that's a strong human being, let's move on?
Yeah, some of the points that you bring up make me want to ask a question that wasn't on the list, because I studied directing, and my undergraduate degree is in directing, and I came out and trying to get work as a director at first, as a young Black woman, was definitely very difficult. And so I spent years working as a set designer and as an actor and other things, because I walked into the room and they're like, "Are you here to audition? Is it an audition today? Like, I thought it was an interview for directors. So why do you assume I'm here to audition?" But there's definitely that sort of bias. And then the question about your health. I don't know what the family situations are for you all, but I know for myself, as someone who became a mother at a very young age, there was also always that question of, are you going to have time to devote to this project? Or, like if my baby is 3 months old and I'm starting a new project, oh my goodness, you're starting a new project with a 3-month-old, and just so much talk about that. And I noticed with men who had new babies, there was never the question of, are you going to be able to do this with the new baby at home? So I'm just curious, were there ever questions related to like your reproductive health or reproductive life that any of you dealt with, and if so, what that experience may have been like?
I will gladly jump in here because I am a parent. My daughter just turned 20 2 weeks ago, so I'm a parent of a 20-year-old. And I was very young when I had her. So all of my adult life, essentially, I've been a parent, and it has always been presumed what I would have time for, what I would or wouldn't be capable of, what about child, like a lot of people made decisions for me, or certainly didn't even ask me before before they decided. And the sort of fascinating part for me is I don't know a different way, because I've been a parent my entire life. So I don't know a version of being a professional that is not having a child. So to me, it was always sort of like, I will figure it out. Ask me the question and let me tell you what I think I have the capacity to manage. Let me tell you if childcare will be an issue, if I, need some accommodation around this. Don't just decide that because I have a kid, I won't want to, or I won't be able to, or I won't have the time. And that was a very, very, very frustrating thing that existed, I would say, well into my daughter being like 14. It wasn't really until she was solidly in her teenage years that people sort of let go of that notion that, oh, you probably can't because of Jordan. That's my daughter's name. Oh, you probably wouldn't want to because of Jordan. Like, that's a conversation for my household to have, not for my employer to have, and certainly not one without me. So yes, that's been a very present element throughout, up till, I mean, now she's 20 and off at college, but people still kind of insert, like Lavina talks about vulnerability, people still kind of insert that question in, when it's like, yeah, I don't think that my male counterparts, even the ones who have families, even the ones who may be single parents, I just don't think they're being asked the same. Or, I mean, and this to me is even more gross, is that say the father makes the choice to be away for 4 weeks to do a gig. There seems to not be the same judgment that I would get, because then people want to know, well, where's your daughter? Who's she with? Or what? And it's like, that actually is not your business. And my daughter is fed because I know how many gigs I can work out of town a year. Like, this is my livelihood. Like, it's not a hobby. I'm not like vacationing and leaving my kid with the neighbors. Mm-hmm. But even if I did, that's my business. Right. But that sort of that like guilt that's visited upon parents, I also just didn't experience my male counterparts having those same pressures applied to them if they chose to work out of town and be away from their families.
And that's so true. And people often will make the decision for you that they're not going to offer you something, thinking that they're being helpful because you can't. But what they don't realize is that they're actually making your life harder by not offering you those opportunities. And by making your life harder, it makes your family's life harder, and that includes your child, right? So yeah, absolutely, that is something that I know I experienced a lot. And I have a son who just turned 20 also. I had him very young. So we have that in common. I want to jump into the next of our key questions, which was in your role as artistic director, because each of you have served as either an artistic director or an associate artistic director. So in your role as an artistic director or a founder of an organization, because I know that is also true for some of you, how has your gender played a part in that experience, and has it played a part? Tia, would you like to jump into that question first?
I don't know that gender has played any role. I mean, I think when I was the associate artistic director of the Shakespeare Academy in Stratford, Connecticut, I did bump up against some stuff there, but it wasn't necessarily gender related. I think, but actually it could have been. I think the issues that I had there were definitely tied into race, and being very, and that was very young in my journey. And so even like kind of calling in things that came up about race, felt that it was a very challenging situation. However, with that position, and I think with my role here at UNC, and then also other opportunities that I've had where I've been able to lead and teach classes and stuff, I've always gotten the feedback of, oh, I've never had a Black woman teach me voice and speech or teach me acting. There was one particular workshop that I had done with Black Girls Love the BARD with the Women's Theater Festival. And I was just doing a master class, and some of the responses from the cast of just me being a Black woman and being in the room and holding space for them was incredible. And I hadn't really heard stuff like that. I've been teaching voice and acting for a while, but I think being in rooms where the cast were folks of color and hearing how they felt about me being in the room, I didn't know. So I don't know that I answered the question, but I forgot what the question was.
That's all right. That's all right. Yeah, throughout my both undergraduate and graduate experience, I never had a professor who was a person of color the whole time. Not even in high school did I have a theater educator of color, and I went to an arts magnet high school, so there were several theater teachers, but none of them were of color. So I have that experience in common also with the people that you were working with in that situation. Dawn, would you like to talk about your experience?
Yeah. I know this is as planned for later in the conversation, but of course it's, to Tia's point, difficult to sometimes extrapolate the gender question from the race question. All of my artistic administrative work has ultimately been in service of white leadership, mostly male, not exclusively, but certainly in my current position as associate artistic director of a theater in California, it is in service of white leadership, and the artistic director is cis, het, middle-aged white guy, like straight up. And I think he has full awareness that that what he was interested in was a thought partner who was different than him. So I don't know, like, if I left the position tomorrow, like, would he hire another Black, like, I don't know that it's as cut and dry as that. But I certainly think when he got the position, he thought about the needs of his cabinet, if I use that analogy. And I think he recognized that that it would be important to sort of have a advisor, a chief of staff, a second chair, who was certainly either or person of color or a woman. And I think that my experience, serves the organization in terms of the conversations that we have. What I'm learning is that that a lot of harm comes to me in the service of white leadership, and I don't know that I thought enough about that in advance of taking these kinds of positions, because sometimes the questions I'm being asked or the things I'm called to advise on are so specific to, like, me then being the voice of women or the voice of not just people of color, but specifically like Black people, Black women, queer Black women. And it's like, I'm a person. and female identities contain multitudes, Black identities contain multitudes, queer identities contain multitudes. Like, I am a person. And, at least in my role at OSF, there were other women of color. It wasn't just relying upon me, but where I am at Aurora, there's three of us now, but at the time that I started, there was only 2 Black women, and there's still only 2 Black women on the senior staff. And so it feels like a lot of pressure sometimes, if I say, well, I don't like this play, but I'm not here to say that all women wouldn't like this play, or all, like, I'm here to say that Dawn Monique Williams, with a very specific taste profile, does not respond favorably to this play. Now, should you want to program it in my capacity as a producer on the staff, I can make that happen. But I don't like it, and I don't want to be anybody's alibi for some sexist, racist. I don't want to be anybody's alibi for some dumb shit. And so the degree to which I am not always free to just, like, be inside of my full self with a full spectrum of likes and dislikes and thoughts and opinions, it proves challenging, I think, in these roles. When there's not enough of us to really have a fulsome conversation, to really reflect that, like, we'll all think the same, we'll all feel the same. But to go back to the question, I'm quite certain that when he hired me, he knew that he needed somebody who was not a cis het white guy to be a thought partner with him.
Mhm. Yeah, and that idea of us being expected to tap into a collective brain that we share with all other people of our identity that share certain identity characteristics with us, I think is something that is a pretty widespread universal experience for people of color in white spaces, and sometimes also for women in general. And that's not something that's expected of white men, for them to represent all white men. You know, they're taken as individuals, and we're taken as a piece of a collective. Yeah. Lavina, what has your experience been?
Listen, I'll just be totally straightforward that I was the artistic director of a South Asian theater company for about 7 years, and the main reason my buddy Jack Ruller, who runs Mixed Blood, likes to say, Lavina is the great generalist and specialist of the American theater. I don't know, that's quite true, right? But you hire me, you're hiring somebody with a BFA in scenic design, a master's in arts management, and an MFA in directing. And as a leader, I'm not interested in necessarily getting into the weeds of everybody. I don't need to. I'm not here to manage the details, right? I'm here to hire smart people and empower them. But for example, I remember in my early days of Rasika Theater Company, I asked about a balance sheet that showed profit. And, in our community, MBAs are more common than masters in arts management. But I remember absolutely getting mansplained. This gentleman leaned over and said, "Let me give you a little business 101." And I was like, "That's cool. Let me give you a little nonprofit 101, right? We shouldn't be showing a profit here. This should balance out to zero." And I mean, Tia, to your point, a lot of what I experienced in my time there was that I had a very specific set of knowledge, and that people within that community were not used to learning from somebody who looked like I did. And for me, I was always very aware of both my youth and my gender identity within that community of, again, a South Asian theater company. And it's just such a bummer, because again, going back to this idea of ambition and of vulnerability, I was trying to be who I was in a space that I was hoping would celebrate that. I found that more often than not, it was treated as a liability, and that was a very hard thing for me. I think, as somebody who was early in my career, to feel like, oh, my main collaborators, it felt like, wanted to silence or did not respond well to my strengths or the parts of myself that I really wanted to share. And I don't know. So ultimately, for me, I found such freedom in leaving and finding a community that did celebrate those parts of me. For me, that was largely, I wouldn't necessarily say my graduate institution, but my cohort of grad school classmates who we remain very tight to this day. I transitioned out of that company at the same time as I was transitioning into grad school, and for me, there was just a huge learning curve there, in terms of, oh, I could breathe. I breathe differently in these spaces that want to celebrate the parts of myself. And so maybe maybe those are the places where I should be pursuing.
Yeah. Thank you, Lavina. I'm going to jump right back to you, if you don't mind, with our next question, which is, the question is often posed: which has had the greater impact on your life, the experience of being a woman or the experience of being a person of color? How do you feel about that question, and how would you answer it?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, right? But I talk about and write about my work, identity conscious work, and right, identity is for me, it's complex, it's intersectional, and parts of my identity are fluid, and yeah. The question is, I don't know. All of those things have had an impact, and depending on the moment, my relationship to my gender identity significant, and it's silly, but like I have a different relationship to the color pink now that I'm a breast cancer survivor. Like I just do. So there's, you know, there's the surface stuff like that I absolutely can articulate off the top of my head, and then there's, you know, the stuff that I feel in my core. You know, there are times where, depending on the space that I'm in, you know, for example, just that question you just asked me, I felt like I was able to answer in a specific way because, you know, the community when I was running Rasika was largely a South Asian community, and so I was more aware of my gender because that was sort of the, I don't know, the less common thing, the less common denominator. So of course, like, it shifts. I think also, like, within one of the things that I really enjoy about being able to be in predominantly South Asian or Asian American spaces is then for me to open up the parts of my identity. I'm like, I'm not just South Asian. I'm not just Indian American. My people are Sindhi, and I love being able to talk about being Sindhi. And so I love being able to, like, have access to that part of my identity in some spaces. So I don't know, that's a long way of saying, like, it's fluid. Again, just going back to this idea of ambition, I really, I have felt, the lack of role models or of people who look like me in the field, and I just find myself returning so often to my girl Mindy Kaling, who, you know, on the Mindy Project is so often collapsed on the ground saying, like, it's so difficult being your own role model. I do recommend it while being fed sour straws, and I don't know, so that's sort of where I'm at with my response to that question these days.
Yeah. Thank you, Lavina. Tia, would you be interested in answering that question next?
I'd be interested. I don't know that I know how. Yeah, I don't know the answer. And I love everything that you just said, Lavina, about it depending on the space that you're in. Because I mean, at times, I think I felt more challenged by my race. And then, especially with, you know, everything else that goes on outside of, you know, just the art institution, just like life and how I was raised, and poverty, education, and seeing what and how Black people are treated and oppressed. So I think that has always been something that I've carried with me. And then at a certain point, just understanding my identity, me identifying as a Black, queer, Christian woman, and seeing how the world works and feeling like, oh, I'm like, am I at the bottom? And like what that means. And so, you know, back to that idea of ambition, sometimes I've had to like call myself out, because it's like, oh, Tia, why do you work that way? Why do you work that hard? You know, like, it'll sometimes, even in conversations like work-life balance and all that stuff. And sometimes I'll have to really like check myself and understand why I operate in the way that I do. And I think it has been this feeling like sometimes I can have certain periods of time of just like unrelenting drive. And it's, I think, sprung from feeling that I was never seen. I was talked over. Ideas would sometimes be literally like taken right out of my mouth. And so that kind of pursuit, I think it's all mixed, especially once I really began to understand and accept who I was, and then how the world was accepting me. And, you know, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that sometimes, you know, one Tia sitting on one shoulder and the other Tia sitting on the other shoulder of like, no, keep going. Or no, make sure you are indispensable. so valuable that, no one would dare treat you in such a way. So I think it's all tied in, but I think race for me has definitely been yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love posing questions to people that I have a hard time answering, so that we all can work through it together. Don, I would love to hear your answer to this question.
Yeah, I am sitting on top of a lot of thoughts. As I said before, it's very difficult, like today, especially not literally today, but like at this age and at this moment in my life, to really separate those aspects of my identity. It's all sort of speculative, like, well, if I was a white woman, would it be like this? Or if I was a Black man, would it be like this? Or, so it's hard to know. I know that I sit very powerfully at the sort of like double bind of being a Black woman. And I've been labeled resistant, and I've been labeled difficult, and I've been called a bitch, and like all these things that these things are certainly visited upon white women, no doubt. But there is also a sort of like mobilization around the virtue of white women that like doesn't happen for women of color. None of my white female friends want that. they don't want that, but it is there for them in a way that, Sojourner Truth said it, right? Ain't I a woman? What I can say is when I reflect on my sort of like earliest memories in life in terms of what was complicated first, race was complicated for me before, and not complicated for me, but like made complicated before gender. And I think that has to do with my primary parent was my mother. And I think I didn't have like a male school teacher until I was like 10 or 11. So many of my early role models, educators were all women. And so there was a kind of normalized thing around femaleness, right? I didn't realize that there was a lot of like discrimination against women, or like I watched my mom change a flat tire, put oil in the car. I watched my mom do everything. So it wasn't until somebody taught me different, my mom was like the badass. Like there wasn't a thing that she couldn't do in my young person's mind. The thing is, my mother was white. Well, she is white. My mother is white. So I knew from a very early age that in that way, I was different from her. And in that way, we were being observed and judged. And that something about that made other people uncomfortable. So I knew very early that racially I was other, that there were questions. Whereas with gender, it like my mom carried a purse, I carried a purse. My mom wore a dress, I'll wear a dress. My mom has high heels, I'm gonna put on my mom's high heels. My mom's playing with makeup, I'm gonna put it on me. And it all felt, it just all felt very normal until like 7th grade when somebody told my mom, like, well, yeah, statistically girls don't do as good in math as boys. I think that's the first time I really remember like, and then of course, then that starts the path. But the racialized things were happening for me at a much early age. And so I think for that reason that I often, in terms of my sense of affinity, I experience affinity in like Black spaces, and I experience affinity in like BIPOC spaces. And I am cautious in spaces that are all white, and I am especially cautious in spaces that are all white women. I don't know if it's the Karen phenomenon or the Becky, I don't know what it is, but the Women's March, all that stuff, it sort of led me to really feel that pang of exclusion that we sort of talk about with like third wave feminism and the difference between being a feminist and a womanist and all of that. I've certainly in the last handful of years felt that very strongly. That's not to say that I don't feel affinity in female spaces, but there's something about white spaces and white female spaces that I'm don't feel as good. Whereas in Black spaces, BIPOC spaces, I feel an affinity. I feel a sense of community. I don't really know if that's an answer.
Oh, it is. Yeah,
Because
no, that's what it is. No, I think that you all actually answered that question very thoroughly. And I know it's a question that I've had difficulty answering when I've been asked that, because I've never walked into a space as a woman who wasn't a person of color. And I've never walked into a space as a person of color who isn't a woman. So I don't know which one has had more impact. They both have been with me every space I've been in. So I love the fact that you all really delved in and answered that question. And it brought up for me another question, especially in some of what you were saying, Dawn, about your experiences as it relates to women. You were specifically speaking about as it relates to spaces that are white women spaces, but in general, the relationship of being an ambitious woman and how you have you found that resistance that you have met or support that you have found has more often come from men or from women? I'm curious about that question for each of you, and I'll give you some time to think about it by talking a little bit about my experience, so you have a chance to think of your answer, since I did not give you this question in advance. So when I was talking about when I came out and started wanting to direct and out of school, the difficulty I had walking into spaces and everyone assuming I was there to audition. And the first person to give me the opportunity to direct was a Black man, Teddy Harrell. And he has been someone who has supported my career and my trajectory in a way that none of the women have. And the women who are artistic directors, I find, are often afraid to take that same chance on a young director, a young female director, and often are hiring the male cis directors that have been working forever, because if they fail, it's a woman failing, whereas the man can hire me and take that chance, and if he fails, it's not his failure, it's my failure. And so I felt like there is, in my experience, I've had times when the men were just more able to take that chance without it reflecting on them, and women have sometimes not felt like they could take that chance. There have been exceptions to that, but that's the experience that I've had. I'm curious what your experiences have been. So I'm going to open it up, and who would like to jump into that question first?
Tia, go ahead.
No, you.
Well, I'll just say off the top of my head what came to mind, Rachel, when you asked that, was that, for me, something I continue to struggle with is people tend to make a lot of assumptions about my ambition, particularly lately as I've become more comfortable and more vocal in my activism, and particularly, using social media sometimes as a platform for that. And I want to be clear that social media is not the only part of my activism, but it does tend to be a part that, gets a lot of public attention. And for example, I have no interest in being an artistic director right now, but I have had a lot of assumptions come my way about, like, oh, well, Lavina's speaking out against that because, like, she wants one of those jobs. I'm like, I do not actually. Those jobs sound really, really hard. I'm not saying I have a solution to these problems, but I am saying, like, hey, we should pay attention to them. But in terms of your question about, like, opportunity, it's interesting because I think the through line for me is that I have experienced the most generosity, I think, from people who have unpacked their relationship to a scarcity mindset. And I've had the most successful collaborations, I think, with people who operate from a place of abundance and therefore are excited to hire me from that place. And I think similarly, like, that's been a huge journey for me, especially over the last, I don't know, for me, 2015 is when I came out of the second master's program. And so, like, that's a very clear marker for me. But so since 2015, really unpacking my own relationship to scarcity versus abundance. I mean, I'll be transparent that 2020 was the year I said, okay, I'm working on operating on a place of abundance this year, right? And then I built up a season that I was really proud of, and then I watched it all sort of fall away. But I think my pal Melissa Dupre likes to say, everything I feel like I lost, ultimately I have found gets replaced with something even better. And so for me, I have found that that relationship to scarcity versus abundance. And I think like I have had less successful collaborations where I have felt the pressure of that scarcity from the person who hires me, right? Of well, you're the only, or you're the first, or the whatever, as opposed to, there should be many directors who operate and identify in the way that you do. So I don't know. Those are some knee-jerk thoughts. But Tia, what were you going to say?
I don't. It's like reflecting back. It seems to me that because like it can be one person and it can be one opportunity that kind of sets a journey forth. It can be one person that does that one thing for you. And just kind of looking back, it has actually been the people who have given me opportunities that I think have really added on to my growth and have set me on this trajectory have been white people in leadership positions, which was my chair, Mark Wing Davey, who not only the awesome thing that happened with him was that I literally went to his door, knocked on the door, was like, hey, can I have this, and that? And he was like, yes. And let me think about this. Yes, which were opportunities to direct, opportunities to assistant direct, and opportunities to continue shadowing my mentor, Scott Miller. Scott Miller, who has also opened many doors, actually Mexican. And then he and his co-founder of MVM, Miller Voice Method, John Patrick, who is a white man, they both opened their arms to me and basically kind of handed, almost gift wrapped, my position here at UNC. And they believed in me in such a way and completely gave me a huge opportunity that really changed my life. And then I would say Vivian Benish, who is a white woman, who's the artistic director at Playmakers right now, and also a mentor of mine before when she was directing a show and I said, hey, I'm interested in directing. She was like, come assist me. And I was like, oh, I've never assisted anybody before. And she was like, it's okay, we'll figure it out along the way. And I was like, dang. And so I'm here with her right now. And even this year, she asked me, well, it's been a year and we just finished. She asked me to direct As You Like It on the main stage. And then she came back to me and said, Tia, how about you close the season and direct How I Learned What I Learned? And I have grown so much since I've been here. And just being honest, it was those people that just like said, Tia, yes. Come here. Yes. How about this? Yes. So, yeah. Which I think is interesting because it's like, oh, not that there aren't people of color in my life who have encouraged me and have mentored me. But these particular people who were white, which I think is important, were in leadership positions to give me the opportunity. And so I think that with that, and also I think it's incredible and important and something that maybe we should all be looking at is that at NYU Grad, which is where I went to school for acting, Mark Wing Davey, when one of my teachers of color, Bev Weidman, who taught voice, when she retired and there was no faculty of color on staff, and they had put out the advertisement for it, Mark noticed that only 10% of the applicants that applied were people of color. And that's when the program was created, the diversity mentorship program. And I was the pilot program for that. And he said, Tia, I think that this would be good for you. So I think that it's important for the white leadership to not only open up those opportunities for people of color, but then to train us. And I feel so grateful for that, because that's what my school did for me. They opened a door for me and then trained me to do the thing that I wanted to do, where there were not necessarily a lot of people of color in that field. Yeah.
Thank you, Tia. Yeah, Dawn.
Yeah, well, like Tia, like Lavina, I'm of a sort of like theater generation where a lot of leadership, most was held by white folks. So so yes, absolutely, it has been the generosity of white folks across a gender spectrum that really got me a lot of key opportunities. And it has really been some really pivotal white folks who invested in me over time, and it wasn't just a one and done sort of thing. Like there had been like a key investment that got me here, and then always my sort of sister friends, sort of BIPOC peers, who were kind of at similar, sort of level as me, that I called on for that kind of emotional, how do I navigate this situation? What about this? I mean, like, Lavina and I have like a constant text thread going. And so I'm really happy to start to see more BIPOC folk step into these leadership positions, because I've been a very loud mouth about saying it's not really a pipeline issue anymore, because there were generous people that provided opportunities for Tia, Lavina, me, maybe you as well, Rachel.
Yeah, sure.
And so that we're here and we're ready. So now it's more about like, okay, generous white folks, are you gonna make a little more space at that table? Are you gonna offer your seat to someone? And so, I want to make sure that I name that certainly a number of white women invested in me over time. I don't want to make it like they're all Karens. They're not. Some of my best friends are white. I love saying that because my mom is white, so there's that. But certainly, like the first person to ever tell me that like I could go to grad school was, a white woman. The first person to hire me professionally to direct a play was a white woman. And the difference has been that sometimes the white guys are really using me to direct by proxy, and I've never had that experience with a white woman. Interestingly enough, I've never had a white woman be trying to direct the play through me, just to like check off a box. I have had a couple of white guys pull that one, but yes, certainly. I don't know that I could really even give you like a numbers or quantify it. Generous white folks in leadership positions, whether it was on their conscience or they, liberal guilt, or they're just good, generous human beings, which I think in most cases it was the latter, gave me a start. However, I will say this about grad school, because I was already 30 when I was going, like Lavina, I have 2 masters, when I was going for my MFA, and I already had a child. I knew that I was only going to go somewhere where I could study with a person of color. And at the time that I was applying, that was like 6 or 7 schools in the country. So my grad school mentor, Gilbert Macaulay, is a Black man. And that was a deliberate, sort of deliberate choice. I mean, I suppose if Yale would have taken me, I would have, foregone that requirement. But for the most part, it was important to me, if I, at my age and with a child, if I was going to uproot my life, I needed actual factual mentorship from a person of color.
Thank you, Dawn. Lavina.
It's funny. Sorry, just listening to you, Dawn. That was also my experience when in looking for grad schools. Was that I was only applying to grad schools that were run at the time. What I was looking for was a grad school that was a program that was run by a woman, and I did end up going to a program that was run by a woman of color. But I also found that, going back to what I originally said about, scarcity versus abundance, I found that in my experience, that person and I had a very difficult collaboration, I think, because of their perception of scarcity in the field, and feeling like, oh, there is, especially, I think, there is ample opportunities for women of color who like to direct heightened language plays. I firmly believe that, but I think that was something I bumped up against from that person in grad school. That, interestingly, the other person in our department, who was a cis white man, had, in my experience, more of a relationship to abundance. And so, like, again, going back to like what I originally said about that conversation, that's how it shook out for me.
Yeah, I could just sense that you had something else to say. It was there.
I also was like the Susan Lucci of graduate school. It's also like a part of my identity. I got in on my 5th time.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. This has been such a rich conversation. I want to thank you all for being so open and sharing so much of your experiences, and I think that there's a lot to take away from what you all have said today for people moving forward, right? That idea of scarcity versus abundance is definitely one that I'm going to take away. The idea of, I'm going to just leave it to my genius to take care of that. I am taking that away for sure. And this idea of, if you're in a space where where your assets are viewed as liabilities, leave that space and find the space where they appreciate you, and that there will be such spaces is something that I am also taking away from this conversation. So I want to thank you all so much. Cannot wait to see Macbeth and take part in that, observing that workshop. So thank you so much, Tia, for your work on that. Thank you, Dawn, for your work with Black Girls Love the Bard as well. Thank you, Lavina, for being here today. And have a wonderful rest of your day, all of you. And thank you to those of you who tuned in to watch this conversation.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks, friends.